Hello everyone, I'm Rion of Bahamut and welcome to the first episode of Why the Hell Do We Care About These People? Since Warriors Orochi assumes some familiarity with the characters, I'm making these segments for anyone who doesn't know anything about them to help provide some context. Now I have been playing these games since Dynasty Warriors 3 and pronunciation of some of the names have changed, so odds are I'm going to be mixing up my pronunciations like Taishi Chi and Taishutsu. I am also neither Japanese or Chinese, so the games are all I have to go on for the pronunciations. I am going to try to keep most of the info only from the games themselves, unless I find something that I think is particularly interesting. I'll be doing my best to keep all my facts straight from the game missions, in-game encyclopedia, and internet sources straight, but I am only one man attempting to write interesting stuff on over 150 characters. Feel free to add any factoids you think are interesting in the comments. Now let's get started with the Dynasty Warriors series. The Dynasty Warriors series began in 1997 on the PlayStation with only 15 characters and was actually a fighting game instead of the hack and slash series it has become. There are currently 8 games in the main line and many side games with a cast of up to 84 playable characters. It is based off of the book Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which itself is based around the period of Chinese history from around 184 AD to roughly 264 AD. The tale starts with the decline of the Han Dynasty with the Yellow Turban Rebellion and 3 leaders rising to fame: Liu Bei, Cao Cao, and Sun Jian. Dong Zhuo then took the reins of the empire and started running it into the ground with his tyrannical rule. This brought about the anti-Dong Zhuo coalition led by Yuan Shao and increased the fame of the 3 future rulers. In the chaos that followed, 3 kingdoms arose: Shu, led by Liu Bei, Wei, led by Cao Cao, and Wu, led by Sun Jian and his family. Various conflicts, alliances, and betrayals eventually gave way to the rise of the Jin dynasty under the Sima family, who ultimately unified China under their rule. Now that is heavily paraphrasing the game, and there are a lot more people involved in this tale. So let's get started with the main focus of these segments, the characters. First up is Ma Chao. Born in 176 AD, he was known as the Splendid Ma Chao due to his immaculate armor. His father was murdered by Cao Cao, so Ma Chao swore vengeance against him and led a fight against Cao Cao at Tong Gate. Unfortunately, he was soundly defeated and Ma Chao was forced to wander the land masterless. During his wandering, he ended up in the service of Liu Bei, which changed his priorities from vengeance against Cao Cao to uniting the land under Liu Bei and his vision of peace and justice. Ma Chao rose in the ranks and became known as one of the 5 tiger generals of Shu. He is generally portrayed as being very hot-blooded and hates injustice above all. His favorite 3 words are righteousness, justice, and vengeance. With his history out of the way, let's move on to the combat demonstration in duel mode. But first, a little terminology. The basic combo from pressing square is referred to as a S string, and charge attacks are referred to by C1, 2, 3, 4, etc. depending on where they show up in the combo. Ma Chao is a speed type and as such has a pretty fast S string along with good range and can move about the battlefield fairly quickly. His triangle attacks are very varied, with attacks for both single targets and larger crowds. His R1s are good for covering a lot of ground, but they are fairly weak in the damage department. His Ma Chao is a great officer killer, assuming you hit the officer and not one of his soldiers slightly to the right of him, of course. His passive is Stamina, which is nice for keeping your health topped off, but I wouldn't go counting on it if you're in dire need of healing. Final thoughts? He is a solid fighter and works well with a lot of teams. I also want to note here that in the older Dynasty Warrior games, Ma Chao was one of the strongest characters in the games. That is, as long as he was on a horse. Just get him the saddle that prevents him from being dismounted and he could take on anyone. Next up is Sima Zhao. He was born in 211 AD and is the second son of Sima Yi and younger brother to Sima She. He starts off as a huge slugger and has a bit of an inferiority complex compared to his father and brother. At one point, he even lets Zhuge Dong, who we will be meeting soon, fall into a trap set by Wu and pretty much just sat by and laughed at him until he was forced to get off his ass by the other officers to go save him. After his father and brother's deaths, he is pretty much forced into the position of Wei's supreme military commander and is paralyzed by his lack of confidence. Around this time, Zhuge Dan defected to Wu, mainly because he was not the biggest fan of Sima Zhao, and Zhao was forced to deal with problems that he created. Through these trials, he grows up and outgrows his slacker nature and becomes a great leader. He then focuses all his efforts on defeating Shu and is successful in ending the Shu kingdom. He is named King of Jin and dies a year later, where his son Sima Yan takes over and founds the Jin dynasty, which eventually unified China under its rule. Sima Zhao is a power type, and a fairly good all-rounded one at that. His range is decent, and his S-string is of average speed, and has a decently wide arc so he doesn't leave many openings. His charge attack hits pretty hard, and you can't really go wrong with surfing a guy to death. His multi-hitting C3 can be a bit wonky to aim at times, but it isn't too hard if you try. His ground R1 hits pretty hard, and his air R1 is a nice combo attack with a dive, so it can open up some distance if you are surrounded. His Ma Chao is average, does decent damage, and hits in a line in front of him, so it is handy for taking out groups in the front. Finally, his passive is Impact, which is nice for keeping the party's Ma Chao bars full for using R1 or Ma Chao attacks. Final thoughts, he is fun to play as, and he won't be holding your team back any. Now that we are done with the Dynasty Warriors, let's talk about the Samurai Warriors. The first Samurai Warriors game was released on the PS2 back in 2004. The series began with 16 characters and now has over 50 playable characters in Samurai Warriors 4. The Samurai Warriors series primarily focuses on the later parts of the Age of Warring States and the beginning years of the Edo period from roughly 1568 AD to 1615 AD. Unlike Dynasty Warriors' three main factions, Samurai Warriors has many splintered factions like the Takeda clan, the Uesugi clan, and the Oda clan. The games put a lot of focus on the three unifiers of Japan, Nobunaga Oda, Hideyoshi Toyotomi, and Ieyasu Tokugawa, as Japan is ultimately unified under the Tokugawa rule. In all honesty, I haven't really played much of the Samurai Warriors outside of the original. I own the third game, but the combat feels really stiff to me compared to its Dynasty counterpart, so I found it really hard to get into, so my knowledge of that series is primarily coming from other sources. I have recently gotten Samurai Warriors 4, whose intro is playing in the background, and it fixes a lot of my gripes about the previous installments, and I definitely recommend it. It's only on the PSN for PS3 owners, but PS4 owners can get an actual disc for it. Now let's move on to our clock-wielding strategist. Now for Henbei Takenaka, the strategist of our heroic trio. He was born in 1544 AD and originally served under Yoshitatsu Saito and his successor Tatsuoki Saito. Tatsuoki was an incompetent leader, and it is said that Henbei and 16 other subordinates were able to capture Inabayama Castle alone. This was done in an effort to get Tatsuoki to realize how poorly defended their province was. When Nobunaga came to take the area, Henbei organized a coup to cause confusion in his master's ranks, which led to Tatsuoki's surrender to Nobunaga. He served Nagamasa Azai for a time, but eventually served Nobunaga Oda and ultimately Hideyoshi Toyotomi and commanded his forces. His personality is pretty laid back and easygoing, so he gets along very well with Sima Zhao. Now, let's move on to his combat demonstration. Our first Samurai Warrior and Wonder type, and unfortunately I'm not really a fan of him. Main reason is his S-string. While it is nice and fast, it is very short range, making him pretty risky to get in an attack with. Which is a shame, since his charge attacks mostly have nice range and area of effect. Especially of note is the wide range of his C4 and his charging C5. His R1s are alright, however the ground version won't make power types flinch, so you have to be careful who you use it on or you risk getting a counterattack. His Ma Chao is also decent, rapid hits in a small arc in front of him, or he can turn temporarily invincible like the rest of the Samurai Warriors, so that gives him some options. His passive, Fellowship, increases damage from switch combos, which is fairly situational in my opinion. Final thoughts, I am not a fan. He could work, but his passive is pretty meh, and his short range during his normal attacks hurt him a lot in my opinion, so use him at your own risk. Our final character of this segment is the mysterious Kaguya. She is our first character of the mystic race, which is the general term used for the legendary characters in the Chinese and Japanese mythology and legends. This is her first appearance in the series, so there isn't much backstory to give on her, but her character is based on Kaguya Hime from the Japanese folktale The Tale of a Bamboo Cutter. The tale is about an old bamboo cutter who cuts open a glowing stalk of bamboo and finds a beautiful baby girl in it. The old man and his wife raise the girl as their own, and within 3 months she is fully grown into a beautiful young maiden. Thousands of men beg for her hand in marriage, but are all turned away by her protective father and forced to remain outside the gates of their manor. 5 men remained steadfast and waited at the gates for days on end just to have a look at her. They were all men with rank in the imperial court, so the old man couldn't chase them away and asked Kaguya if she would consider the prospect of marriage. She said that each suitor should retrieve 1 of 5 rare items before she would even consider them, and they all failed. Even the emperor visited the estate and after sneaking into her room was entranced by Kaguya's beauty and supernatural abilities, but he too was refused by her. 3 years later, Kaguya sadly informs her family that she was from the moon and that in a week she will be forced to return to her own kind by the king of the celestial realm. The emperor forms an army to fight the celestial beings. However, when the king of the celestial realm descends on a cloud, no one could bring themselves to lift their weapons against its grand visage. The king thanked the woodcutter for caring for Kaguya so well, and called for Kaguya to depart with him. She left behind letters for her loved ones and secretly a medicine of immortality in the emperor's letter. The emperor burned both the letter and the medicine at the top of the highest mountain in hopes that his thoughts would reach Kaguya on the moon. Now let's move on to how well she does in combat. Now we are getting to a samurai warrior style fighter I can get behind. Kaguya is a technique type and an excellent one at that. Her S-string has great range and speed, and her charged attacks have a decent variety to them. It is really easy to juggle enemies with her charge attacks, and if you are surrounded, her C3 hits multiple times all around her. Her R1s are no slouches either, with decent power behind them and good 360-degree range. Her Mitsuo attack is her weakest point for me. It hits in a large range with multiple rapid hits for very little damage, but if you have good attack stats and strong weapon, it can do some decent damage. She also has the option of turning invincible like all samurai warriors and just use her good combos instead. Her passive is Trinity, which will give you a lot of triple strikes for fun and profit if you're ever hunting for gems. Final thoughts? She kicks a lot of ass, and her passive is really useful, so you really can't go wrong with her. That's it for this round. Next time, we make our first attempt to change the past and hopefully save everyone from their horrible fates. This has been Rayon of Bahamut, and I hope to see you all again next time.